Welcome to another Rush Generations Health Education lecture. Rush Generations and our staff is delighted to be your source of information, resources, and health promotion programs that help maximize your well-being and good health as you age. Today is Wednesday, June 24th. I'm Patrick, and I'll be your moderator for today's lecture, Brain Health and Alzheimer's Awareness. We're pleased to present this program in recognition of June as National Alzheimer's and Brain Health Month. Before I present to you the wonderful speaker joining us today, I'd like to first thank Danelia Mitchum for helping with the production of this lecture. She will be helping us manage the chat and other key aspects so that we can all have a great discussion about brain health and distinguishing normal aging from early signs of dementia. As always, we're live streaming this lecture through our YouTube channel using the video platform Zoom, which also allows us to host a good number of people who are joining us through the phone. So if you're hearing us through the phone, welcome, and thank you so much for joining us. For those of you on YouTube, we ask that you please use the chat function to ask questions, and you can also add to the discussion throughout the lecture. We will make sure that your comments and questions make it to the presenter. And for those of you listening to the discussion on your phone, you will also have the opportunity at the end of the presentation to unmute your audio so that you can ask your questions. So we'd like to remind you that all information offered here is for general informational purposes only, and to always seek additional professional advice from licensed professionals for situations specific to you and your needs. So without further ado, I want to introduce our presenter for today. Susan Frick has worked with the Rush Alzheimer's Disease Center since 1997. She coordinates dementia-specific training programs for healthcare professionals, helps coordinate the Dementia Friendly and Dementia Friends initiatives in Illinois, facilitates Without Warning, a support group for individuals and families who live with younger onset Alzheimer's. She also works closely with patients and families in the Rush Memory Clinic and with people involved in Rush Alzheimer's Disease Center's research studies. Additionally, she is the executive producer of the documentary created by Without Warning entitled Too Soon to Forget: The Journey of Younger Onset Alzheimer's Disease, which airs on PBS Passport, Amazon Prime, and the Too Soon to Forget website. Everyone, please give a warm welcome to Susan Frick, and I will pass it off to you.
Thank you so much. And I appreciate being here and that you're interested in this topic. And I am going to screen share for just a minute. So can tell there we go. And hopefully that shows all fine. If there's anything blocking, please let me know. But I'm here. I'm work at the Rush Alzheimer's Disease Center at Rush, which you'll probably hear me refer to as RADC. That's our acronym for Rush Alzheimer's Disease Center. And going to talk a bit with you today on what is brain health, what we're learning about brain health. There's been a lot we've been learning from some of our very large research studies, and also thinking about what is Alzheimer's and how do we distinguish it from aging in general. And so that will be our, let me just pull this back up here. There we go. Here's what we'll talk about today, looking at aging and cognition, normal aging versus dementia, how to support our brain health. We'll talk about quite a bit because that comes from some very large research studies that we have at the RADC, which I'll describe. They're very interesting, and I work quite a bit with those research studies. And then thinking about what are the typical resources that are necessary for people who are living with dementia and also their extended family or social network of people. And so let's first start with aging and cognition. I sure do. I think about it a lot. Both my parents had dementia along with many other family members. So I think about what is healthy aging a good bit. And we're sure learning, and I'm sure we've all heard that as we get older, there can be decline. in cognition. And that is true. But what we sure have been learning over the years in a very large study that came out a few years back from the Yale School of Public Health, looking at 11,000 people, was that while there is some decline in cognitive ability, it isn't inevitable. And a lot has to do, what they found in the people that they watched had to do with attitude and with mood. And that really fits a good bit with what we're seeing in brain health too. And so I think as we all get older, keeping in mind how we approach that and how we look at that can have quite an impact on how our cognition does as we get older. And so when we think about what is normal aging versus dementia, or often what we think of as Alzheimer's disease, but there's many forms of dementia. We often lean towards this warning signs. These are the 10 warning signs for Alzheimer's disease, so they're definitely lean more towards that type of dementia, and is the one we often probably think about most commonly in communities. But I think as what I often try to think about is for all of us as we get older, or at probably even not as older, um, we can have troubles, intermittent troubles with our memory or with other areas of cognitive ability. And that's common and sure can happen. You know, I look through this list and think about, which I know some of you are on the phone. So let me talk through um, this the list of normal aging versus dementia looks at memory problems with problem solving, ability to complete familiar tasks, confusion of time and place, trouble understanding the visual world around you, and struggling sometimes with figuring out being able to do steps or go up a curb, or understanding, if there's a lot of pattern in a carpet, that can be difficult. Judgment issues, problems with language, with misplacing things, and then change in personality, how you interact at work or in social activities, or change in mood and personality. All of those things can be changed because of your cognitive ability and how the brain is working. And so all of us can struggle with some of those things at times, but for people with dementia, it starts to get much more pronounced, and it can start in varying ways for different people. What we commonly see when we're thinking about Alzheimer's dementia is a change in memory needs to be one of the areas that we see as a problem. And when we say memory, it's often short-term memory. So things that happened in the, you know, in the most recent past, but things that happened a long time ago, they can remember really well for a long period of time. And so that we start to see typically early on with Alzheimer's disease. And then at least one of the other areas, whether it be communication, whether it be activities of daily living, or change in personality. One of those things along with the memory is what's common for Alzheimer's disease. For other forms of dementia, it can be a little bit different. And boy, I've heard anywhere from 70 into the hundreds, 100 forms of dementia. But the most common that we see is Alzheimer's disease, or Lewy body, or dementia from Parkinson's, or frontal temporal dementia. Those are all common ones. And so I think for to what we should all think about is just occasional trouble with memory is not dementia. It needs to progress to where it's more things are happening more frequently and more of a problem. And so that's why what I often hear when I'm talking with people, or I saw in my own family too, is that you don't know right away that there's a problem occurring. It has to build over some time. And when I think my mom was much more of a classic Alzheimer's presentation, where my dad was probably more vascular, which is another one I didn't mention in that list. Vascular dementia is very common. For my mom, it progressed slowly over years. And so when we finally realized what was happening with her, it was the common thing you hear from people. We would say, well, now that we know she's living with this, we think she was experiencing problems 3, 4, 5 years ago, but it took a bit to see the pattern. This isn't something that comes on suddenly. It's a slow, gradual change for it to be Alzheimer's disease. And so those are the things you want to look at: change in memory, change in communication, change in activities of daily living, and mood. And, and so those are the common areas that start to have troubles as someone has is moving into dementia. And so now we're going to spend a good chunk of our time on how do we support brain health. And so at the Rush Alzheimer's Disease Center, we have actually the largest research studies in the world that are looking at how why some people develop neurological problems and some people don't. And so we have thousands actually of people between several studies that have agreed to yearly testing where we go and meet with them every year. They're all over the age of or close to the age of 65 and above. We meet with, and they're people who aren't really experiencing significant memory problems when they sign up, because they have to sign a consent and agree to it. We go and meet with these people every year, as gathering as much information as we can for the rest of their lives. And then when they pass away, they all donate their brain, the fluid around the brain, the spinal cord, and a little bit of nerve and muscle from the arm and leg. And what that gives us is the ability to see what the person is like while they're living and collect this information on memory, but also lifestyle. And then we compare it to what we see in the brain. And so we've had our religious orders study was the first study. It's been going, and I think we have about 1,500 nuns, priests, and brothers from around the country that have been involved in that study. And it's been going, I'd say 31, 32 years. And then we have a study called the Memory and Aging Project, which we're up to, I think, around 2,600 people who have either been in it or are currently in it. That is in continuing care communities around Chicago and also people who still live in their own homes around those continuing care communities. Then we have a study that is over 20 years old now that's in the African American community, and a study that's in the Latino community because those groups often are at higher risk for Alzheimer's disease, and so often underrepresented in studies. So I just wanted to give you an outline of how we're learning these things. So what we've seen in a lot of the people who have been in our study and then passed away, and there are people, a good group, size group, that never show signs of memory problems while they're living. But then when we look at their brain, they have the pathology of Alzheimer's disease in there, which is really interesting. And so then we went and said, well, what have they been doing that was protective, that kept them, that even though they had the signs of Alzheimer's disease in their brain, the pathology, they didn't show it while they were living. And that's what we're going to go through now. And so we go back and look at all the data we collected on those people and realize that a good number of them participated in some of these lifestyle choices. And so what I think is important to us and how, like, I think about it a lot, given my family history, I try to incorporate a lot of these things into my daily life and thinking about that maybe this would have a protective factor. And that even if I have the pathology of Alzheimer's in my brain, that I don't show it, which I think that's what, I think probably we'd all vote to not have the pathology at all. But if we were going to have the pathology, what do we do to help reduce that risk? And so the first one here on the screen is cognitive activity. We're finding that people who engage in cognitive activity on a regular basis seems to create a protective factor for yourself and for your brain. And so the fact you're zooming in or listening to this at a later time shows you're someone who's interested in cognitive activity. So you're already doing this one, but we're finding that people who stay curious about life, keep involved in reading or listening to talks and taking in things, playing games. We find we do a lengthy social history with people in our study, both the studies, and this isn't anything that will change for us. But I think to keep in mind why it's important for younger, our grandchildren and great grandchildren is that learning an instrument or learning a language at a younger age seems to have a protective factor as you get older. I once was, and I think at any age, if you're working that part of your brain, but we're seeing it in when people learn at a young age too. I was at a continuing care community giving a talk, and a group of women were sitting, and it was they were all Caucasian. The only reason I bring this up is they were sitting in the front of, well, as I was getting ready, and they were all speaking Spanish to each other. And I could tell it was not their native language. And so I went up to them and I said, I just got to ask, what are you all doing? And they said, we're in taking a Spanish language class at the continuing care community where they lived. And they said, we're practicing, which what a great thing to do as a group. And this kind of cognitive activity we're finding has immense benefit and can help reduce your risk of showing the signs of Alzheimer's disease, even if you have the, the plaques and tangles there in your brain. The next one we're finding is physical activity. People in our study, we have them wear, I have this an Apple Watch that I'm holding up, but we have people wear a gadget for 10 days that are in our memory and aging project study and a couple of the others. And they wear it and we collect how physically active they are. So we're finding that people who move around will, get out and get so many steps. Not that it has to be, if you're someone who works out regularly, that's great. It has great benefit. We're finding though that even just movement throughout the day has huge benefit. And so, the more you can get out and do things, work in steps. People, a lot of the people that are part of this research study live in continuing care communities. So I always stress with them, in which they tend to have long hallways, and they might have a lot of be a distance away from like the dining room or the activity room or things to do. And I always try to say that is a benefit because you have to walk a ways. So if you're out and about in your community and you're, parking somewhere, I always try to park a little ways out. Don't go for that really front space. Park a bit, get a little bit of extra steps as you're moving around. We're finding that risk factors, and I tuck them in where I can so they don't relate as best as possible to physical activity. But we're finding that people who have like Parkinson's signs, so some of the what you can notice sometimes for someone who has Parkinson's, the shaking, the tremors, the difficulty moving can be a risk factor. Can be someone's a little more prone to show the signs of dementia then, or unexplained weight loss. And we probably have people we know in our lives that all of a sudden just lost weight and they weren't sure why. That sometimes can be a risk factor and can be the signs of other problems. So something just to consider. And then this links to being physically active is moving outside your home space, whatever your home space is. If you're still in your own home or apartment, or if you're living in a senior community, is it just getting out? We're finding that people who get out and move around on a regular basis seem to do better with memory than people who don't. And there can be a lot of reasons why people don't get out as much and move around as much. Um, and we'll talk about it in a bit, but some can be related to mood. Some can be related to physical ability to move. Pain sure can be a huge one too. And we're finding that people who tend to be more sedentary, more just sitting and not getting up and moving, they're at higher risk for showing signs of dementia than people who are up and moving around more. And so, I think we've all thought about for healthy aging that movement was good for our heart and good for just our physical being, but we maybe didn't always relate it to brain health. And we'll hear this a couple times in a few of these other topic things we're learning, but we're learning that what is good for the heart tends to also be good for the brain. And so the fact that, movement is good for the heart means it's also good for the brain. And it kind of makes sense of, that's taking in oxygen, it's getting your blood moving, it's things are pumping through the body. It's also pumping through the brain. And so that is going to have benefits. So when you think about your day and think about, okay, is there ways I can work in physical activity and that it has might be there being good for your heart, but now think about it also as good for your brain. And we've learned this because of monitoring people's physical um, activities that are in our study. And then the next one. So the first two, I think, cognitive and physical, I think makes sense that those people who are engaging in those things, yeah, that there's kind of a natural link, I think, between brain health and those. The others here, maybe not quite as much. And so what we're finding is people who stay social, people who stay connected to people as they get older, seem to do better with their brain than people who don't stay connected. And there can be so many different reasons why some people are more social than others. It could be, some people are just naturally drawn to seek out other people. Some people not as much. We have a risk factor here of people who report loneliness. We sure, I think, through the pandemic and maybe even before, really thought a lot about loneliness and what it means to be lonely. The thing with loneliness is it is a self-perceived emotion. And so some people can be in a crowd of others but still feel isolated and feel lonely. Some people aren't around many at other, have only a few interactions with people on a regular basis, and they're totally fine. They maybe just don't need it as much. And so loneliness is a perceived emotion. And as we go through all of these, but I think in particular the rest, we're all wired certain ways. We just come into the world this way. And so I think to think about if you are someone who feels lonely, to think about are there things you can do to help reduce that feeling? Because we're seeing that feeling lonely, I mean, we knew it had an impact on your mood, but now we're realizing it has an impact on your brain too. And so it's worth trying to work on that if that's an issue for you. So the more you can stay connected to others, the more you can stay engaged in activities. And I know we're doing this all online, and so that it is. You're probably at home alone watching this. So I know the computer sometimes we can be connected to others and online, but I think also wanting to make sure you're having contacts that are important to you. So whether the online is enough, maybe that works for you, but I think also having some groups where you see people and you're interacting with people is important too. We're finding that people who report being depressed can, and we all have periods of time when we're depressed. It's hard to get through life without having those moments. But we're finding that people who can get through those moments and come through on the other side, we kind of look at it as resiliency, people who can get through life's events and come out. Again, sometimes it can take a while, but I think we all know people, or maybe we have been that person who goes through some event and really has trouble shaking that feeling, or or live in a depressed state a lot. I'm sure you know people where, we refer to the phrase, see the world, the glass is half full or half empty. The people who tend to see the glass as half empty all the time are at greater risk. The people who tend to be seeing the world or glass as half full, that seems to be protective. And so to think about where for each of us, where do we fall in that? And is there something we need to do? And I think it's harder as we get older to maintain our social circles. I sure am seeing that in myself, but I also saw it in my parents who were very social people, but then they moved to a continuing care community out of state. They moved from this area, from the Chicago area, to Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, so which is where my dad was from. So they had connection there, but still, and it took them some time to like get their space and their world there. And I also could see it in my mom, who had Alzheimer's, that she was a very social person, but as things started to early on, even in the disease process for her, she started kind of pulling in and wasn't as social. And I think it was because she was very afraid of making a mistake in public and goofing something up. And so I could see that retreat for her. And that can be very common for people as they struggle more with memory, is to kind of pull in. And that's hard to kind of go against that natural feeling to withdraw. But the more you can stay social, the better. Um, and then this, and I kind of jumped ahead on some of them. We also have found that having a sense of purpose can be protective. And so maintaining, figuring out what your purpose is as you get older can also be a challenge. It can also be great. You can redefine what your purpose is, or you can really go in deeper on something that's important to you. But those people who maintain a sense of purpose seem to do better with their brain as they get older than people who don't. And so, and purpose can be different for everyone. Being connected to a group like this through Rush Generations, keeping involved and interested in life, that can be purpose. Staying involved in a faith community, if that's something that is for you. Being involved in groups, networks, clubs, anything. That seems to have an immense protective factor. We're finding that people who are conscientious and think about more than just themselves, which I think kind of leans into that sense of purpose. Because if you're thinking about purpose, it's often includes a little bit more than just yourself, and sometimes a great bit more than yourself. We're finding, like I've already talked on depression, but we're finding that people who have struggled with depression are at greater risk. People who seem to be narcissistic, people who where with narcissism, you're much more focused on just yourself and not really thinking about others. And so it kind of makes you not have as much of a sense of purpose. Or your purpose is very internal, where we want to be thinking a little bit more outside of ourselves. So we find this from our participants because we do pretty extensive social histories and interviews with them every year, asking about mood, but also asking about what fills their day and how they are involved. And so we collect this sense of purpose from people. And then here's one. There are a few of them that I probably struggle with the most, so I put them off towards the end. Getting good sleep. For a lot of us as we get older, getting a good night's, full good night of sleep can be a joy, and not as easy to come by. We're finding that it's a protective factor if you're someone who can pretty regularly get a good number of hours of sleep consecutive. Now, I know as we get older, it's easier to wake more often, get up to go to the bathroom more often, have maybe trouble falling back to sleep, have issues with sleep apnea or wearing a CPAP machine. Um, but the more you can work on your sleep, it does seem to be a protective factor for those. who maybe have the signs of dementia or the pathology of dementia in their brain, they might not show it while they're living. And what we're seeing with sleep is when you get a frequent interrupted sleep, you're not getting into deep sleep as much. And when you're not getting, when what happens when you're in deep sleep, even different from REM sleep is great too, but deep sleep, there seems to be almost a cleansing of the brain going on when you're in deep sleep, that there is some thought that during that deep sleep, the brain is helping almost wash out the plaques that can develop in the brain that are one of the classic signs of Alzheimer's disease. And so the more you can get deep sleep, the better. Now, I know some of us, it's just hard. I wear my Apple Watch at night, which I'm not sure is a benefit, because every morning I'm looking to see how much sleep I got, and in particular, how much deep sleep. And it's a struggle to get deep sleep sometimes. And so, if sleep is an issue for you, to talk to your doctor to see if there's things you can do to help you sleep better. Looking at like there's even issues, and you've maybe had talks on this, but there's issues with sleep hygiene, like thinking about what do you do in those hours building up to sleep? How do you how are you during the day? Are you napping a lot during the day, which can cause problems with sleep at night? Are you drinking too much caffeine? I'm someone who has to limit my caffeine intake by now. I usually by noon stop caffeine intake. Thinking about alcohol intake. Do you, there alcohol a lot of times can help us get to sleep, but it often won't help you to stay asleep. And so you might wake in the middle of the night and then have trouble getting back to sleep. So, are you someone who has electronics close by you as you're sleeping? Are you looking at screens? Are you turning on the TV? That can all have trouble with helping you stay in longer periods of sleep. So I think if sleep is an issue for you, think about, are there things you can do to help get better hours of sleep? I sure have had to work on my sleep. That is something I've struggled with for decades, and it's better. I still have nights that are bad, but overall, it's much better than it was. And so I had to really, really work at it to kind of think about that, and thinking about that it's not just good for my mood and how I feel that next day, but it has long-term effects on your health, but also your brain. And then this last one is healthy eating, which there's a lot listed here, and I'll run through them. But one thing, if you want to look, there is a diet that's actually come from our research called the MIND diet, mind like brain, MIND diet. It's had a lot of press and a lot of publicity, and it's come from our study. And we ask people in our studies, they fill out every year when we meet with them a survey on what they eat on a regular basis. And then those people well, we look at all of them, but in particular for those people who have the pathology of Alzheimer's, but they don't show it, we really look at what are they eating. And it's a lot of the elements of the MIND diet. The MIND diet has done so well and been so promising in what it's showing that it received its own very large grant from the National Institute on Health and Aging to look at it even more closely with a broader group of people than were just in our study. And it still showed immense promise. And what I love about the MIND diet is we're seeing that even if you adhere to it moderately, like 30% of the time, it has brain benefit, and then if you can even do more, that's even better. So, if you're at all interested in, and I bet you've maybe had talks on this, or you've had some information, look up the MIND diet. But there's elements like with any diet, and this isn't a diet to lose weight. This is a diet that's solely for brain health. And it's a merging of the Mediterranean diet with the DASH diet, which is the diet that's more for your heart. And so it's the two kind of melded together. And we're finding again that the food that is good for your heart is also good for the brain. And so in the Mind Diet, there is lists of like how often you should try to get certain foods. So we won't probably get into that as much today, but you sure can and look that up. And then of course, as with any diet, there's things to avoid. So here are the few items that we're finding as being having brain benefit. Your omega-3 fatty acids, which you find in fish mainly, or fish oil tablets. But we're finding that people, for all of these things, if you can get them in the actual food source as opposed to a supplement, um, it is better. Now, talk with your doctor. You know, supplements are great, but we don't want to rely on them to be the main way we get those nutrients. We want to try to get it as much as possible in the actual food. So omega-3 fatty acids, which is the fish, and not all fish is alike. For the omega 3s. Like tilapia is very low on the scale for omega 3s, where salmon, walleye, I think mackerel, um, sardines, if you can eat them. I always feel like when I say sardines, I show that I cannot eat them. But I for a long time was all vegetarian, no fish. I've tried to work fish back into my diet just because of what we're seeing in this study. So I try to have salmon semi-regular basis. I also take chia seeds, or flax seeds has it too, has omega-3. So I put chia seeds into a shake that I make. So that can help. Antioxidants, we're seeing that people who eat dark berries is where you get a lot of your antioxidants, but also dark leafy vegetables. But we really look at the berries the most. If you can get those on a regular basis, so again, those go into that shake I make on a daily basis, but we're finding that they have great benefit. Um, Olive oil, a good olive oil on a regular basis. Some people, a lot of times when I'm talking to seniors in our study, they're always like, where am I going to get olive oil on a regular basis? And and a lot of times it's used in cooking or in getting the food prepared. Also, if you're someone who eats a salad, if every once in a while you can just do a olive oil based dressing, that will help you get the olive oil. So that's what we're seeing as a benefit. Whole grains, again, looking at when you're purchasing something, looking for whole grain as opposed to the word multigrain, which isn't giving you the entire grain in there. And so the whole grains are better. Um, Lean proteins, if you can steer away from the heavier red meat, getting more chicken, fish, tofu if you can do it. I love tofu, but not everybody does. But if you can lean more towards those proteins, the better. I know as we go through this list, we all have our foods that we love that maybe aren't the best for us. I think it's hard to go in thinking I'm just never going to eat those because we're all going to eat them at some point. But if we can reduce it. So, if you're someone who likes red meat, if there's times where you can say, oh, I would have had it, but I ordered something else instead, or I made the chicken instead of having the hamburger or steak or whatever, that's a plus. I think that's good. Leafy greens, which we already talked about, nuts. We're finding that nuts, they have vitamin E in them, and if you're able just to get, and almonds probably has the highest. Walnuts, I think, is up there too. Like a cashew, not as much. So I think, figuring out if you're able to eat nuts, tossing them on sometime when you can. Eating legumes, beans, those have great benefit. We're also seeing in our diet wine, red wine in particular, seems to have benefit. Now, I know recently alcohol has been seen as like having a increasing your cancer risk and not being good even at all. Um, we're still saying the wine because we're seeing it in the study as having brain benefit, but only consumed in moderation, not large quantities of it. And so things to avoid, um, processed, it's all the things we know as being, rough on the heart. Processed foods, sugar, the red meat, and then cheese. We are seeing that cheese doesn't seem to be beneficial. And I think back to my dad, when like he'd come home from work and he thought he was eating a healthy snack, he would have cheese and crackers. And so he always had a block of cheese in the refrigerator, and that he thought he was getting calcium, and which he was. But we're seeing it as that there's the processing of some cheese can be problematic. I have heard recently from our person who's coordinating the mind diet studies now that low fat cheese in moderation might be not as terrible as having, the full fat. If you can do the low fat, that's a little bit better. And then risk factors in regards to eating. People who have trouble with diabetes, cerebral vascular disease, high cholesterol, high blood pressure, those are all things that a lot of us live with as we get older. And so to think about working on those if that's an issue for you. And so we're finding that they can be a risk factor when out of control and not being, worked on. And so, I think a lot of us think about our blood sugar level, especially since they've reduced what tips us into being pre-diabetic. I think a lot of us think about that. So kind of keeping in mind, how am I doing with that? Because we are seeing that not only is that good for your heart, but it's good for the brain. And so, I know anytime I talk on food or on healthy eating, that healthy eating's tricky because it's expensive, and what you can have access to, what you're able to be able to have in your home can be hard. And I think it can also just be overwhelming to the point that you're like, what's the point? I can't stick to a good diet all the time. So what's the point? But we're finding, like I said, that even if you adhere to this moderately, there is benefit. So I think about what are those things you can work in or remove from your diet on a moderate to more regular basis, and that is going to have benefit just to be able to do that. And so all these things we've learned, cognitive activity, physical activity, being social, having purpose, moving around out of your space, sleep and healthy eating. We're seeing this all from our participants in the study who we collect all this information on them every year and then take a look at their brain after they pass away and then go back and look and say, those people who had the pathology of Alzheimer's, what have they been doing? And a lot of times it's these things. So we didn't know this years ago. I've worked in this field almost 40 years now, and I've worked at the Rush Alzheimer's Disease Center 29, which is when the Memory and Aging Project started. We didn't know that there was lifestyle choices that could have an impact on brain health. And so the fact we've come this far in learning these things, I think this relates to what that first study we talked about shows that cognitive decline can happen as we get older, but mood and lifestyle can have a huge impact on whether we show the signs of dementia while we're living or not. Um, and so, what are common resources for families and for people who are living with this already? These are things I get involved with a lot, being a social worker. And so, just having to learn about the disease, learn about how, you know, when you have a disease that impacts the brain, it has an impact on everything of daily life. So communication, daily functioning, personality, your role within the family, all of that changes. And so I spend a good bit of time talking with people with dementia and with their family members about how to adjust to these changes. And then there are kind of some common resources that are out there for people who are either experiencing this or a caregiver to a person experiencing this. And it can be a lot of advanced planning, thinking about, and it's something we should all have in place, but thinking about What are our financial, wishes as we get older? What are our medical wishes as we get older? Who do we want speaking for us in at the time? Are they aware of what we want? All of those things are important. If someone's young, which I work with a lot of people who are young with Alzheimer's disease, they can apply for disability. And then common resources that people utilize is home care, day programs, respite, um, assisted living or skilled care, and then palliative care or hospice. People can qualify for both with an Alzheimer's or other dementia diagnosis. And so, I push hard for people to consider using palliative or hospice as the disease progresses. And then this illness can cause people to feel very lonely. And so we spend a lot of time thinking about how do we encourage people to become part of support groups or part of networks where they can go and interact with other people and know that they're not the only one going through this. There's also around the whole state of Illinois now, around the country, there are things called memory cafes. They're very popular. They tend to be free, like neighborhood groups where people with dementia and one other person or two can come together and be involved in a social activity. And it's nice to be in a space where they can be around other people who understand. And so if you're someone who's caring for someone or if you're someone living with this, look for memory cafes in your area. Um, and then just so you know, the Rush Alzheimer's Disease Center is one of 37 federally funded Alzheimer's centers funded by the National Institute on Health and Aging. Um, you know, it's been a little rough this last year with changes going on at NIH, but we're hanging in there. We're also one of three state-funded centers. So it's us, Northwestern, and Southern Illinois Alzheimer's Center, which is located in Springfield. This just lists what we're involved in. We have the epidemiological studies, which is what I've just been presenting on. Those are our very large studies. Those are observational studies. We have the largest repository of tissue and samples in the world. I think we are the largest of the Alzheimer's centers. We have around 200 staff people at the RADC. We're very involved in clinical trials, which I'm not as involved in that team of people, but those are people who are already diagnosed or at risk, and they're testing something. It's a clinical trial, so they're testing a drug or they're testing a way to diagnose or treat to see. And then we have, and I'm involved in this, the education and outreach. We have a very large group of us that give these kind of talks and give all different types of talks and are out in the community building networks and building connections with people so that they're aware of us, they know about Alzheimer's disease, and then can be involved in projects that are going around the state. And then we have our memory clinic where people come to either be diagnosed or when they've had a change in condition with the dementia. And then just so you're aware too, we are the state leads for two initiatives in the state that's called Dementia Friendly Communities and Dementia Friends. And I would encourage you to check out the Dementia Friendly America website. Just Google Dementia Friendly America, and you can become a dementia friend through that website. You just watch a couple of videos, and the Dementia Friends is a community awareness program that's encouraging people to understand why it's important to stay connected to people with dementia in their community. And so we have been helping spearhead these initiatives across the state. And actually, since I turned in these slides, we've had two more communities become dementia friendly. So we're up to 54 communities across the state of Illinois where a community comes together. Like I'm in the Westmont Public Library right now to give this talk. Westmont is a designated dementia friendly community. And it's because people in Westmont came together and thought about what are some simple things we could do to either support people living with dementia or help educate the community. And so we've had 54 communities across the state become, and we have an application still in, so we're going to be at 55 soon. And it's been, I'm one of the persons who helps lead that initiative, and it's been just a really interesting and fun program. And then also check out, we host and run the website Illinois Cognitive Resources Network, or it's called ilbrainhealth.org. illinoisbrainhealth.org, IL. It has a lot of resources about dementia, about Alzheimer's disease, and then all the information about Dementia Friendly Illinois and Dementia Friends. So it's worth checking out that website. And then I will stop sharing. Yes, I think this doesn't really need to be shown. So, and I know we're getting close on time, but if there's anything with questions.
All right. Thank you so much, Susan. All right, we do have one question in the chat. So we do want to encourage our folks on YouTube to write their questions in the chat so that our presenter today can answer them. And also, once we get through with the questions on the chat, we'll open it up to our call-in folks to see if they have questions as well. It's more of a comment than a question, but I think it's something you might be able to speak to, Susan. One of the comments is that I think a few of the social determinants of health are a factor in many older adults not being able to do things like get out of the house and be active. So, like we talked about, how like those are like the biggest predictors of that you're seeing is just being able to get out of the house and do things and socialize. But they say things like not having a neighborhood environment that's conducive to getting
Mm,
out, being active and socializing, lack of green space and safe and welcoming spaces to socialize can all be a part of that. Anything you want to add to that? Or
definitely. And we are sure seeing that. We have quite a few researchers who focus on social determinants of health. And we're sure, and like I said early on, we have these studies in the African American community and in the Latino community because they are groups that tend to be at higher risk for showing signs of dementia. And sometimes they're, for them, not in every case, but it can be tricky. To be in a neighborhood where they can have access to these things and the ability to get out. And also we're seeing that higher levels of heart issues and can be be a problem too for for some people. And so we're seeing that that can have an impact. And so if that is an issue, and if you're in a space where that's harder, I think trying to find ways, things like this, then, if there's ways you can stay connected to people, can be a benefit. So I think figuring out what is it for you, how, what is your space like and how can you make it as best as possible to which isn't always easy, I know, but to kind of help reduce some of those barriers that you might be experiencing.
yes, absolutely. So another question is how prevalent is early onset? And what is the youngest age that you've seen?
Oh, okay. Um, there's some thought that for younger onset dementia, so not just looking at Alzheimer's, that it can be up to about 10% of those diagnosed. We don't have a clear understanding of exactly how many people have dementia who are young. I can tell you, so at through the Rush Alzheimer's Disease Center, we have run a support group for 24 years now. Jeez. No, 22 years now, for people with young onset Alzheimer's disease called Without Warning. And we have information about it if you want to look it up. And when we started the group, we were starting it because we were seeing more and more people in our clinic who were young. And there wasn't at the time, and still isn't even, a lot of resources for people who are young. So we started the support group and we grew so fast. And we then, at some point, it was a group for people with dementia and the family members. We started getting where at our monthly meetings, we were around 80 people coming to a meeting, which, as a social worker, that is like running a mini conference and is a crazy number of people. But I think spoke to the lack of resources for people who were young. And so we would divide into about 5 or 6 different groups at the same time for them. So I think there are people out there who are young for sure. I think we're getting a little bit more aware to diagnose. It's a little startling when you have someone, in their typically they're in their 50s or 60s, but they can be younger. I had a gentleman who was late 30s, who was diagnosed, but it wasn't a definite that it was Alzheimer's, but I've had people in their 40s. Typically, there are some people where it runs in the family line and you can see it. You can see it multiple generations of someone who's had it young. They tend to be the ones more in their 40s or early 50s. People who get it in their late 50s, early 60s, that doesn't tend to have the familial link that you see in people who are much younger. So it does happen if you're someone or know someone who is living with young onset. You want to make sure you get a good evaluation of what's going on to make sure that it's nothing else that could be causing the dementia. And so, you know, we don't have a clear answer on the number, but, it can be around 10% of those diagnosed.
All right. Thank you so much, Susan. So we'll give our folks who called in a chance to ask your questions. So if you called in and you do have a question, please select *6 on your phone that you're calling in on, and you can unmute to ask your question. So if there's no questions from those who called in, I think we can move on. Don't worry, if you need to unmute and you need to interrupt me, that's okay too. I'll just wrap up. So, Susan, thank you so incredibly much for sharing your time and your
Excuse
immense
me.
expertise and experience with us. Oh, it's looking like we do have someone unmuting to ask a question. Great. Go ahead. We hear you.
Actually, good afternoon. I actually have two questions. I wanted to ask if research shows that stopping at any point really does help. Does it undo anything? In other words, kind of like they talk about when people were smoking, even if you stop smoking, that the lungs start to repair themselves as soon as you basically give up the nicotine. Is there anything in terms of the research that shows that, for example, if someone has not eaten healthy,
Oh, okay,
because,
got it.
um, but is still relatively healthy from a cardiovascular perspective or prediabetes perspective and has been able to get away with it, can you undo any of those things, or does the mind continue to remember the intake that has been over the decades?
So the question wasn't just in regards to smoking, it was about the healthy lifestyle things too.
Right.
Right.
Not about
Okay.
smoking. I'm talking about literally
Sure.
things that have to do with diet and
Sure.
Alzheimer's and
Yeah.
dementia.
Right. We do ask what people are doing currently and also how long they've been doing it. So we are seeing that, the brain is constantly growing and changing and melding. So that we're finding that it does, like, you don't want to say, oh, I didn't do it 10 years ago, so why start now? That there is benefit even in starting, even at a later age, for those things. So, we are seeing benefit in that. I can't speak to, and I don't know, I've never heard from any of our researchers if there's any like it needs to be a certain amount of time. I have not heard them say that. So I think starting any of these at any point can have benefit.
Thank you. And then the other question is, do you have any opinion on the process of diagnosis if you have had familial or
Oh,
genetic
if you
link
do,
to a parent? And because if you're going under stressors or crises, they tell you not to get tested because obviously the brain is in a different place trying to sort of caregive and take.
yeah.
Uh, um, do you have any recommendations?
So definitely talk with your doctor because I'm not the end all be all on this. But what I've heard people say is it can depend on the age of your parent when they had dementia. So if your parent was like both my parents were older, they were late 70s, 80s when they were starting to have problems. So there doesn't tend to be as strong a familial in the people who, when you have someone in your family who where the symptoms showed older age. Um, for even younger, I've had people ask if they should be tested, and unless there's a strong familial history, they often don't do genetic testing with people. Because the one thing is, what do you do with that information? And most times we're just
Mhm.
looking at risk factor. And so it doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be showing dementia. And I think there can be such stress in looking at something like that. And would you want your insurance to know if you had a risk factor and you maybe were never showed the signs of it. You know, you maybe have heard that there is a new blood test out, which has been FDA approved to be used
Mhm.
for looking at Alzheimer's disease. I've had people call me and ask if they, should get that blood test. The blood test is only used for adding to an assessment in a clinic. So it's not used like I couldn't go to my doc, I shouldn't go to my doctor and say, "Hey, I'd like to have that blood test just to see." Because you might be one of those people who have the pathology of Alzheimer's in your brain but never show it while you're living. You know, like all these people in our study. But the blood test would pick up that you have the pathology of Alzheimer's. And so we don't do those things. So most times I've heard physicians say they don't recommend doing genetic testing. What I've always heard and say to people is we should all live kind of with the assumption that we might be at risk and might be having dementia and live looking at all these lifestyle things and trying to incorporate that into your life. So I hope that answers, I hope that answers the question.
Yes, thank you so much.
You bet.
All right. Thank you all so much for your participation today. And again, thank you so much, Susan, for sharing your time and your expertise with us. We are eternally grateful to you, and as one of our many experts that contributes to our lectures. Um, Again, thank you so much. Can't say that enough. So. Um, but yeah, that concludes our lecture for today. I will go over some of our upcoming programs and services that are available for you if you would like to stay on. So, first and foremost, we have coming up the Wellness Recovery Action Plan, known as WRAP. This is a free 8-week program for anyone to learn skills to get well and stay well and make life more enjoyable. This workshop will teach participants to develop a daily wellness plan, discover simple and safe strategies, and create plans for responding to stress, negative thoughts, and challenging times. The group meets once per week for 8 weeks for 2 hours. The next workshop will be held in person at the Southeast Atlas Regional Senior Center located at 1767 East 79th Street, which is in South Chicago, Illinois 60649, and it will be Tuesdays starting July 7th through August 25th from 1 p.m. to 3 p.m. So for that, you will need to become a member of the Senior Center. So you do need to be 55 years of age or better or have a disability and sign up with the Office of Department of Family and Support Services to register for that program. So let us know if you want more information. And next is Take Charge of Your Health, which is a 6-week workshop for people with ongoing health conditions. Learn how to build skills to gain confidence, better manage your health, and lead a more active life. Over the course of 6 weeks, we will discuss goal setting, nutrition, physical activity, medication and pain management, effective communication, and strategies for working with healthcare professionals. The next workshop will be held in person at the new Sankofa Village Wellness Center, located at 4305 West Madison Street, Chicago, Illinois, 60624 in the Garfield Park neighborhood. This will be on Tuesdays starting July 14th and going through August 25th from 9:30 a.m. to noon. And always, we want to share with you the Shaman Senior Voices program. Shaman Senior Voices aims to empower older adults to discuss what matters most to them as they age. It is important to share what matters most to you with your physician and your loved ones. Shaman Senior Voices wants to hear from you. Please consider sharing your wisdom on why it is important for your healthcare team and your loved ones to know your goals and wishes and what matters most to you at aging.rush.edu/shaman/collaborate and connect. Or you can scan the QR code on your screen to record on a mobile device or smartphone. And then also keep in mind that our next lecture for the Rest Generations program will be on mental health and aging on Wednesday, July 1st. And we are going to start at 1 p.m. sharp right here on the YouTube page. Thank you all so incredibly much for your time today, and we look forward to seeing you at the next one.